May 5th, 1945. Wageningen wakes to a new kind of silence. No more gunfire, but not yet the sound of celebration. In a narrow street, dusted with the gray residue of winter, a little girl sits on a low step, her dress ragged, her hair tangled, her feet bare in wooden clogs that have long lost their shape. Her cheeks are hollow hollows. A soldier kneels before her, lowering his face until it is level with hers. He opens his hand and holds out a D-ration chocolate bar, the small, bitter brick of emergency food every American infantryman carried. The girl's fingers close over it like she is catching a life preserver. Staff Sergeant William Cooper does not have orders to hand out sweets. He has barely had time to sleep. But for a moment, the war narrows to that small brown rectangle and the tremor in the child's jaw when she says, "Thank you." The image fixes. It becomes a moral question for anyone who sees it. What do you do when victory meets a famine such that feeding a child feels more urgent than conserving a soldier's rations? What happens when soldiers choose to feed children instead of conserving rations? If this moment is drawing you in, stay with us to see how a single act changed a nation's story. To understand why that chocolate mattered so much, we have to go back to the winter before liberation and follow a chain of choices and calamities that turned harvest and harbor into hunger. In September 1944, a railway strike meant to hinder German transports became a political gamble with devastating civilian consequences. In response, German authorities imposed a deliberate embargo on food and fuel shipments to the western provinces of the Netherlands. The deprivation did not arrive as a single day of suffering. It was a slow collapse. Stores emptied, coal ran out, people burned furniture and floorboards to keep rooms from freezing. Families who had once eaten full, ordinary meals began to stretch what they had, grains, a few preserved vegetables, until there was nothing left. By late 1944 and into the winter that followed, rations dwindled to a fraction of the normal intake. By the spring of 1945, daily calories for many in the affected areas fell to between 400 and 800 a day, numbers that are clinical on the page but catastrophic in practice. Food that sustained a child for a day was now supposed to stretch to 2 or 3 lives. Tens of thousands died during that winter of deprivation. Among the dead were between 2,500 and 3,000 children, little bodies that could not be sustained by thin soups and boiled bulbs. The official statistics are stark. The human faces behind them are what the soldiers found in the streets. Those statistics tell one part of the story. The other is lived testimony, passages of paper and voice that survived the winter. In a diary entry discovered later, a Dutch mother named Anna Vandenberg wrote with a clarity that cuts through numbers, "If Americans don't come soon, she won't survive."
The line is both a plea and a measure of the helplessness mothers felt, no longer a political complaint, but a personal forecast of loss unless relief arrived. Medical accounts from the period described a pattern clinicians knew too well: marasmus, severe wasting, followed by organ stress. Dr. Henrik Mulder, a pediatrician who treated many of the wave of children admitted to clinics after liberation, later described patients who were skin over bone, whose muscles had shrunk, and whose immune systems were so compromised that ordinary infections could become fatal. He spoke not of sensational detail, but of clinical stages, the body attempting to conserve energy, the decline of fat and muscle, the eventual failure of organs when refeeding was mismanaged or when infections took hold. Recovery, he emphasized, would not be quick. It required carefully supervised feeding over weeks or months, vitamin supplementation, and watchful medical management to avoid the deadly complications of rapid refeeding. Beyond the clinics, the emotional toll was obvious. Children who had known only hunger were timid around food. Some hoarded their portions, others refused unfamiliar diets because their bodies associated eating with pain or scarcity. Parents carried the weight of shame and grief. Communities had to relearn how to care for children whose growth had been interrupted by months of chronic malnutrition. These were not problems solved by airdropped crates alone. The Allied response to the humanitarian crisis moved on two tracks: strategic military decisions about how to conclude the war, and emergency humanitarian operations intended to alleviate hunger. Airlift operations, known as Operation Manna and Operation Chowhound, would in time bring tons of food into the starving regions. Planes released pallets of grain, powdered milk, and other rations over large swaths of the Netherlands, a logistical effort that required negotiation and coordination across battle lines. Those airdrops were a lifeline, but they were also limited. Aircraft could not reach into every town and lane where children crouched on doorsteps. Pallets could not be walked directly to a child's hands. Distribution still required boots on the ground, coordinated supply chains, and, often, the improvised compassion of soldiers who happened to be there when civilians needed a bite. This is where the tension between bureaucratic logistics and immediate human need becomes vivid. High Command weighed the goals of continuing the offensive against Germany and the imperative to rescue starving civilians. For many soldiers at the front, that debate resolved itself in a simple, immediate way. There was a child in front of them, and the child's hunger could not wait for headquarters to file an extra requisition form. The testimony of the men who walked those streets is both plain-spoken and powerful.
Captain Thomas Morrison, a company commander, later described his unit's first days in a village whose name now reads like a map pin in liberation histories. They expected to help secure towns and then move on. Instead, they found civilians who could not rise from beds or gather in the square without assistance. Morrison's company had to improvise, transforming a combat unit into a relief team. They broke emergency rations, shared personal food, and opened mess kits to strangers. The measures were small but immediate: a cigarette exchanged for a cup of broth, a soldier's blanket given to a shivering mother, the ration bar that became a seed of trust. Private First Class Eugene Henderson wrote home about the moments that were never part of training. In a letter preserved among other soldier correspondence, he described children who clutched at their hands when they saw men in uniform, at once hopeful and terrified. Henderson did not write of glory or victory. He wrote of feeding. The lines are spare, the tone almost embarrassed by its tenderness, relief and a sorrow that needed no editing. These letters, fragmentary, personal, serve as the human counterpoint to official reports. Still, even acts of private charity faced limits. Coffins, cold stores, and the sheer volume of need meant that not every chocolate bar could become a miracle. Airdrops arrived, but were insufficient to replace months of missed nutrition or to meet the needs of scattered hamlets. Brigades of men had to make moral decisions with practical constraints, keep rations for the unit's continued mobility, or give away food and risk operational readiness. Many chose the immediate human option. The sequence of liberation days, units moving in, flags raised, telegrams sent, can make it easy to miss what soldiers actually encountered when they reached towns like Wageningen. The streets were not scenes of jubilant parades, but places where survival had become the only visible task. Children sat on stoops with cheeks that suggested a map of hunger. Parents offered what they could and often had nothing to give. Soldiers found themselves doing things for which they had not been trained, setting up feeding centers in commandeered schoolrooms, organizing queues of children for a piece of bread, calming families who had lost children during the winter. The moment we opened the scene with, the chocolate bar in Cooper's hand, was repeated in countless small variations across the liberated zones. A corporal tearing open a can of K-rations and letting a child taste the fatty beef inside. A sergeant brushing crumbs from his own bread loaf and offering half. These were not orchestrated relief operations. They were soldiers making moral choices in real time. But the story of immediate compassion did not end with a few shared ration bars. Once the initial shock passed and military control became more stable, a concerted effort to rehabilitate the starving took shape.
Medical teams established clinics that addressed the complex needs of severely malnourished children. The first principle was do no harm. That is, refeeding had to be slow and carefully managed. Doctors supervised diets, beginning with easily digestible broths and incremental protein and calorie increases to avoid refeeding syndrome, the very real danger that can strike bodies deprived of essential nutrients. Beyond pure nutrition, recovery required access to vitamins, particularly niacin, thiamine, and vitamin C, which helped the body repair damaged tissues and immune function. Children received supplements and monitored caloric increases over weeks. For many, the progress was visible. Color returned to cheeks, hair regained some luster, and muscles slowly refilled. For others, the damage was deeper and required months, sometimes years of follow-up care. Psychological recovery followed alongside the medical. Soldiers and relief workers recognized that hunger left scars on behavior. Children anxious at mealtimes, parents haunted by the loss of children, whole neighborhoods that had become frayed with grief. Recreational programs were organized to bring some normalcy back. Games, songs, improvised classrooms, and even baseball. In one town, an American unit taught a group of Dutch boys how to play. The laughter, the sudden unself-conscious running was a small but powerful sign that the rhythms of childhood could be reclaimed. Schools reopened, not simply as places of instruction, but as centers for community recovery. The bonds formed in those months were not ephemeral. Veterans who had handed a ration bar to a child sometimes returned years later to find adults who remembered the man who knelt and fed them. Letters and reunions recorded how gratitude deepened into cross-Atlantic friendships, dinners, exchanges of photographs, and visits that bridged the wartime gulf. For many Dutch families, the memory of being fed by uniformed strangers was the kernel of a lifelong debt of gratitude that turned into cultural ties between communities and American veterans' families. It is important to keep perspective on what those acts accomplished and what they did not. Feeding a child on the street could save a life and spark recovery, but it did not instantly erase months of wartime trauma or repair every body. Some children never fully regained the height and strength they would have had without the winter's deprivation. Some families carried a loss that no ration could replace. Doctors like Dr. Mulder emphasized that while medical interventions and community programs improved survival and quality of life, the consequences of malnutrition, stunted growth, vulnerability to disease, and emotional scars could last for years. The moral dimension remains central. Soldiers operated within a military system that had objectives and constraints, yet many chose to prioritize life over logistics in the moment. That choice was not merely sentimental.
It represented a form of moral leadership performed on the ground when policies and supply lines were still catching up to need. When an officer consented to open a ration pack for a child, when a soldier gave his own chocolate, he enacted a principle that extended beyond that single act. The recognition that the end of combat was not only the cessation of fighting, but a responsibility to heal. Operation Mana and Operation Chowhund, the aerial relief efforts, deserve careful recognition. They were monumental in scale and resulted from strategic decisions to use air logistics for humanitarian outcomes. Pallets delivered powdered milk, grain, and other essentials directly into the areas cut off by the embargo. They were life-saving and symbolically important. People saw planes overhead and knew that help was en route. Yet such operations had limits of precision and distribution. Pallets could fall near a field, a churchyard, or a central square, but the final meters of delivering food from crate to child required the same human hands that had flexed a chocolate bar into one small palm. The complexity of the response, the mix of airdrops, organized medical relief, and individual soldier compassion left an enduring legacy. Hospitals and clinics established for emergency feeding became the seeds for longer-term public health initiatives. Dutch communities rebuilt, in part because small acts of kindness rekindled social trust, and because Allied attention brought resources and expertise that had been absent during the winter. Veterans' stories, kept alive by letters and reunions, shaped the way future generations recalled those days, not solely as a military victory, but as a moral reckoning. Consider for a moment the wider human arithmetic. A child saved from starvation could become a teacher, a parent, a neighbor, whose life rippled outward. That is not a claim of miraculous transformation, but a sober observation about investment in human life. Every meal shared in Wageningen and every supervised clinic meant that one more person could contribute to the post-war recovery and future of the Netherlands. There are quieter dimensions to the legacy as well. Soldiers who had been trained to see the enemy and seize objectives learned to see civilians as people with names and histories. These lessons persisted. Men who handed out rations often carried the memory of those faces the rest of their lives. Dutch families who received care remembered the dignity of small gestures, the way a soldier fixed a child's shoe or sat and listened while a mother named her lost child. These small human acts seeded a durable affection across generations. We must also recognize the limits of commemoration. Not every story is neat, not every child was saved, and not every veteran returned home without carrying painful memories. The history records both the success of relief efforts and the sorrow of those who could not be saved.
The legacy, therefore, is not triumphal, but complex. A moral choice made under pressure that yielded real lives saved and lasting relationships, and a reminder of what happens when institutions and individuals respond to human need. As we circle back to that scene in Wageningen, the image feels less like an anecdote and more like a symbol. The soldier with the chocolate bar embodied a decision to place immediate human need above strict resource conservation. That decision was repeated thousands of times in small increments, each one not inconsequential. Together, they formed a pattern of humanity amid the administrative and military structures of war. In the years that followed, survivors told their stories. Children who had clutched ration bars and tasted relief would sometimes point to a photograph of an American soldier as if to say, "There was someone who saved me." Local commemorations and exchanges between veterans and Dutch communities kept the memory alive. Official histories of air operations and military campaigns recorded the technical facts, what was flown and when, but the human record of what soldiers did on the street is kept in letters, diaries, and personal reunions. What are we to take away from the incredible story of American soldiers saving Dutch kids from the brink of starvation? One takeaway is practical. Humanitarian crises require both logistics and human presence. Large-scale operations like Operation Manna and Chowhound were essential, but so too were the soldiers who improvised relief in village squares. Another takeaway is moral. The smallest act of compassion can have consequences that reverberate across decades. A ration bar given by an individual soldier was not a full policy response, it was a moral stance. And finally, the story is a testament to recovery as a process.
Rehabilitation was medical, psychological, and social. It took clinics, supervised feeding, vitamins, play, and time. It took people willing to stay and help communities rebuild routines that hunger had dissolved. The survivors, the medical teams, the soldiers who carried out both discipline and compassion each contributed to a more humane aftermath than could have been achieved by strategy alone. If you want to learn more about the operations and personal testimonies that shaped this history, explore the archival sources in the description and watch related survivor interviews and documentary material we've gathered. The names Cooper, Morrison, Henderson, Dr. Mulder, Anna Vandenberg are entry points into a broader story of suffering, choice, and recovery. Their experiences and the choices of thousands of unnamed soldiers and civilians remind us that amid logistical systems and wartime plans, the moral question is often immediate and personal. Will you feed the child? In the end, victory over armies became meaningful when it translated into care for the living.
American soldiers in the Netherlands did more than secure towns. In countless small acts, they helped pull children back from the brink. Their choices changed individual lives, and through those lives helped shape a nation's recovery. The memory of those moments remains a quiet testament to the power of compassion exercised at precisely the time it was needed most.